Trust the small work of God within you. Trust the work, trust the small work, trust the small work of God within you.
So, my name is Lee Curtis. I'm the canon to the ordinary here in the Diocese of the Rio Grande, which means I work directly for and with the bishop on congregational life and vitality, communications in the diocese, crisis response, and transitions. I also do a fair amount of work on our border ministries, and I love talking with the folks who are discerning here in the diocese and willing to offer themselves to ministry.
So, where do we start?
So I think a lot of times when folks are thinking about the way that ordination or discerning whether ordination would be for them, they can get really hung up on what is it that I want to do? And does ordination get me into doing that? And what I want to talk about first, as this plays into community, is what does my order of ministry ask me to be, whether that's layperson, deacon, priest.
Take a moment to pause and reflect. So, what do the various orders of ministry ask of us? And how are these demands both liberating and limiting?
Something that has to come in really quickly is what I like to think of as a radical availability. Now, of course, we get to set some boundaries on that. But to be able for us to follow God's call into whatever order of ministry we're in, that radical availability, which is going to include things like being willing to step out of the community that I'm in. And if you are not willing or able to do that, then it may be that the freedom to dive deep in one community is what you need, in which case there are some questions about being ordered into ministry in a particular way that I would ask. If that's a value for you, and I think it absolutely is for most of the people in our churches and should be, then that should be a kind of a big clue of where is it that the Spirit's willing to work or calling you to be.
Take a moment to pause and reflect. How does this idea of radical availability land with you? And how much do you feel your present sense of calling yoked to your current community?
Now, I do think there are more people who are there are people who are excited by that radical availability and this whole, like, the separating of function from order, or the separating of what you do from who you are, right? There's some people who want to be a deacon, who want to be, dip a toe in different communities and get to know their hearts and get to know and set them on fire to engage with the world around them, and then move on and do it again. Like, there's some people who that's really engaging. The same thing with the priesthood. There are some people who are willing to step out of their communities to engage with the wider church. Whether that's here locally in the diocese or anywhere. I mean, I really think the need is there for dedicated priests all over the church, but it's just not always where we are, right? But I actually think we're at a point now in the church, and I think it's the experience of most clergy, not all, but most clergy, that you are moving every 5 to 7 years. Now, those may not be huge moves. It may be, a congregation on one side of town to the other. But we do have to be willing to make that move. this is the biggest thing I want to get, that um, there are different things that are required in each order. And some of those things will set your heart on fire, and some of those things will scare.
Take a moment to pause and reflect. What sets your heart on fire? What scares you to death?
Well, and that does bring to mind, I think a big piece of what we're catching here is we are in a transitional moment. We are in not around the nature of work generally, where it was not uncommon 10, 15 years ago for one rector to stay in one place for 35 years, to spend the entirety of their career in this one congregation. That was fairly common. But that also kind of tracked with the secular world, right? Where you would be in about the same position for 20 to 30 years, where you would retire with a pension, right? There were incentives to keep you in this one spot. And so I do think there's a shifting expectation around what priest means, where we have, or deacon for that matter, where as few as 20 years ago, we really saw the revival of the diaconate, which some folks thought on kind of the Orthodox model, where they certainly work this way, where a deacon becomes kind of the major domo of the congregation, and you have the priests that kind of drop through, but the deacons really holding it down. That's how our friends in the Eastern Church work, or the Roman Catholic model, where they are kind of tenders of the flame, if you will. Again, it's much more local. They can be moved around, but really aren't. Mm-hmm. The expectations that we've set around the diaconate and the Episcopal Church, as coming out of the diaconal ministry in the Book of Acts, does demand a flexibility and a listening and a being open to being in these liminal transitional situations, standing between the church and the world, communicating the needs of the world to the church, inspiring the church to go. Like, to be a deacon is to be like, are you good with being in uncomfortable spaces between really distinct worlds and being able to translate? Yeah. Right? Like, for some folks that's terrifying, and for other folks, like, put me in, coach, I'm right there, and again, that's different than models we've seen in other places, where diaconal stability is like they're layperson plus, right?
Take a moment to pause and reflect. How does your heart respond to these varying visions of the diaconate? A more local and stable manifestation, as in the Roman and Orthodox churches, versus this more mobile and dynamic manifestation in the Episcopal Church?
So again, if all of these things are sounding iffy, well then what are the gifts of lay ministry, right?
Let's take another moment to pause and reflect. What are the unique gifts of lay ministry?
That you get to go deep in a place, that you get to see the life of a community grow and change over decades, that you get to have a ministry that has a life of 25, 30 years, right? And you're the ones who tend to it, because right now the average term of a rectorate in particular in the Episcopal Church is 6.5 years. And with the kind of great resignation, great retirement that we're going through that now, that number is actually shortening up.
Let's pause and reflect. Canon Lee suggests that lay ministry offers the chance to go deep within a single community over many years. What are the costs and benefits for you of stability versus mobility in your ministry?
And unfortunately, I see a lot of priests who get ordained this way, and they're not able or unwilling to not even relocate, but travel, you know? So let's say you live in, Las Cruces. Well, are you willing to drive a half an hour to Deming or an hour and a half to Silver City? Or if you live up north, you know, let's say, are you willing to pitch in Las Vegas or with some of the regional chapels in the Enchanted Circle, or with Chama or with Espanola? Or again, these are places where you can live in one spot, but are you willing to one, not have a fixed role, but not necessarily a fixed community? Are you willing to kind of put down some miles to get to a place where you can exercise that? And in fact, I think that this may be it. If you're willing to have a fixed role but not a fixed community, is kind of where you are on that. Or are you willing to have a fixed community but not a fixed role? Right? That might be the not the dichotomy, but the spectrum that we're playing on. Right? Because as a layperson, like, you can be the treasurer one year, you can be the senior warden the next, you can be diving hard on children's programming one year, you can be leading a feeding ministry the next.
Let's pause and reflect. I wonder where you find your current sense of call on the spectrum between a stable or fixed role and a stable or fixed community.
We know that ministry in the future is going to require mobility. And that may be mobility kind of within a region. It might also be nationwide or even worldwide mobility.
Take a moment to pause and reflect on your own relationship to the idea of mobility when it comes to ministry.
We know that it's going to require a flexibility of skill sets. We know that, you know, unfortunately, the expectations around clergy being administrators as well is not going away anytime soon. We're also seeing that particularly in our smaller congregations. A lot of the folks who had the expertise to keep what is essentially a small nonprofit running are going on to glory. And so there are some pieces of, are you able to get in and get to the heart of an issue quickly, or connect that small community to the diocese? That's one of the things that we're trying to do is engage more with our missions to make it so that when priests arrive, they're able to focus on priestly ministry. So that ability to not be a specialist, to be a generalist, and have a little bit of a lot of things.
Take another moment to pause and reflect on the flexibility of your skills. Are you more of a specialist or more of a generalist when it comes to ministry?
And as folks are discerning where things are going, what I don't want them to be discerning is how things were.
Right.
Discerning whether they fit into a pattern that doesn't exist anymore. And so going in really open-eyed about the practicalities of this work, understanding that it's not going to be what it looked like for many of us, particularly if you've been in the Episcopal Church for 30 years or more.
Let's pause and reflect. The church and the world have changed and are changing so quickly. How are those changes affecting you? Which changes excite you? Which changes frighten you? Which changes make you sad?
Trust the work, trust the small work, trust the small work of God within you. Trust the work, trust the small